Much of New Orleans sits below sea level. The river runs above it. Water surrounds it from every direction. The ground it's built on is sinking into the Gulf. Hurricane season comes every year without fail, and the city sits directly in its path. By every rational measure, nothing should be here. Most people who know this story assume they know the answer. The port, the river, commerce. And yes, that's part of the story. But it doesn't explain why America keeps investing in it. It doesn't explain the billions spent on levees after Katrina, or the political will to rebuild a place that floods on ground that sinks in a hurricane corridor. And it definitely doesn't explain this. Somewhere in central Louisiana right now, the Army Corps of Engineers is actively preventing the Mississippi River from abandoning New Orleans entirely. The river has been trying to leave for decades. Engineers have been holding it in place. That fight is ongoing, with no end in sight. And if they ever lose it, the consequences would reach far beyond Louisiana. That's the story this video is actually about. Not whether New Orleans can survive the next hurricane. Whether America can afford to lose the river system that made this city possible, and what's at stake if it does. Pick almost any river between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians. Follow it long enough and it ends up in the same place. The Missouri drains Montana and the Dakotas. The Ohio pulls in water from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The Arkansas carries runoff from Colorado. They converge, one by one, into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi flows south. The drainage basin covers 1.2 million square miles, 31 states, 2 Canadian provinces. Everything from the wheat fields of Montana to the steel mills of Pittsburgh eventually drains toward the Gulf through one system. Nearly half the continental United States drains into this system, and it has one outlet. Before railroads, before highways, before any of it, water was how you moved heavy things. A farmer in Ohio couldn't haul a ton of grain over the Appalachians to reach the Atlantic coast. The mountains made that too impractical. But he could float it down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, and from there to New Orleans, and from New Orleans to anywhere on Earth. The entire interior of a continent had a single exit. A city had to exist at that exit. This is why the French founded New Orleans in 1718. It's why the Americans paid Napoleon $15 million for the territory in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't about land. It was about the mouth of the river. Jefferson understood that whoever controlled that mouth controlled the economic life of every farm and settlement in the interior. He was right then, he's still right now. The geography didn't suggest a city at the mouth of the Mississippi. It required one. But a city required a river. And the river, it turns out, had other ideas. Stand on the levee south of New Orleans and watch the river go by. Not the water, the ships. Bulk carriers loaded with grain. Tankers carrying crude oil and refined petroleum. Barges, hundreds of them, lashed together in floating islands a quarter-mile long, pushing upriver against the current. The Mississippi, between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, is one of the busiest industrial waterways on Earth, and it looks it. The grain numbers are staggering. The United States exports roughly 60 million metric tons of grain through the lower Mississippi every year, enough to fill a line of grain trucks stretching from New York to Los Angeles and back 3 times over. Grain elevators lining the river south of Baton Rouge fill up, and ships bound for Egypt, Japan, Mexico, and Brazil come to empty them. When this corridor slows, food prices move. Not just in Louisiana, but on commodity markets in Chicago, in grain exchanges in London, in bread prices in Cairo. Then there's energy. The stretch of river between New Orleans and Baton Rouge hosts one of the densest concentrations of refinery and petrochemical infrastructure in the world. Louisiana's coastal zone accounts for roughly 18% of total U.S. oil production and nearly a quarter of its natural gas. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the emergency stockpile that buffers America against supply shocks, is stored in underground salt caverns in southern Louisiana, located here for the same reason everything else is. The economics of why all this sits here come down to one number. River transport costs roughly 1/10 of what rail costs per mile. It's simple physics. Moving heavy things on water is cheap in a way that no truck or train can match, and the agricultural and energy economy of the American interior is built on that fact. This isn't a regional port wearing a city's name. It's national infrastructure. The city is almost incidental to what happens here. Almost. The same geography that made New Orleans economically necessary also cut it off from the rest of America for most of its history. And that isolation created something else, just as difficult to replace. New Orleans doesn't feel like the rest of America, and there are geographic reasons why. For most of its history, the city was surrounded by swamp, river, and lake. Getting here was easy by water and difficult by land. So while other American cities were increasingly connected to each other, New Orleans remained relatively isolated. The city built inward for 2 centuries before it connected outward. That isolation mattered. The same geography that made New Orleans economically important also made it culturally unique. This was where things converged. Goods arrived here from across a continent. People arrived here from across an empire. French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and Creole influences all met in the same place, layered on top of each other over generations. New Orleans became a cultural gateway for the same reason it became a trade gateway. It sat at a bottleneck. You can see that most clearly in the city's music. African musical traditions carried by enslaved people mixed here with European and Caribbean influences arriving through one of the busiest ports in North America. Congo Square, just a few blocks from the French Quarter, became one of the places where those traditions met. The sound that emerged would eventually become jazz. The port made that collision possible. The isolation made the result stick. The same pattern shows up across the city. In the food, in the language, in traditions like Mardi Gras that still organize civic life in ways that feel unusual in modern America. New Orleans didn't just develop differently from other American cities. For a long time, it developed separately. And that's why none of this can simply be relocated. The port is irreplaceable because the infrastructure took more than a century to build. The city is irreplaceable for the same reason, just measured in culture instead of concrete. That distinction matters, because in August 2005, America got an unexpected test. For a brief moment, it lost both at the same time. Hurricane Katrina made landfall on August 29, 2005. The storm itself was survivable. The levee failures were not. Flood walls failed in more than 50 places. 80% of New Orleans flooded. Some neighborhoods went underwater to the roofline. More than 1,800 people died. The federal response became one of the defining political failures of the era. But from an economic standpoint, Katrina was something else entirely. It was a live stress test of everything we've been talking about. The Port of New Orleans closed the day the storm arrived. The grain corridor shut down with it. Refineries went offline. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf Coast took a direct hit. Within days, the effects were showing up far beyond Louisiana. Grain prices moved on global markets. Fuel prices climbed across the country. Supply chains that depended on the Mississippi corridor suddenly had a problem. Katrina caused an estimated $125 billion in total damage. The port closure alone cost the U.S. economy roughly $250 million per day in lost trade. Per day. And within weeks, countries that couldn't find New Orleans on a map were feeling the consequences. The test result was unambiguous. This corridor was as important as advertised. The levees were going to be rebuilt because the port had to reopen. That decision came quickly. Rebuilding communities was harder. The lower Ninth Ward and other heavily damaged neighborhoods waited longer for recovery. Residents scattered to Houston, Atlanta, Memphis, and cities across the country. Many never returned. The New Orleans of today remains smaller than the New Orleans that existed before Katrina. The recovery revealed something uncomfortable. Restoring infrastructure and restoring a city are not the same thing. One can happen on a government timetable. The other can take generations. But the larger lesson was clear. Katrina didn't create a new vulnerability. It exposed one that already existed. And the threat most people remember from Katrina, the hurricane, the flooding, the levee failures, isn't the scenario that worries engineers most. That threat begins nearly 300 miles upstream, and it doesn't involve rain. The Mississippi River hasn't always flowed through New Orleans. Rivers aren't fixed, the channels move. Over geological time, the Mississippi has swung back and forth across its floodplain like a slow pendulum, cutting new paths, abandoning old ones, chasing shorter and steeper routes to the sea. The channel through New Orleans isn't permanent. It's just the route the river happens to be using right now. And the river has been changing its preference for decades. About 300 miles north of New Orleans, a tributary called the Atchafalaya River branches off to the west. It's shorter than the Mississippi's current path. It's steeper. It reaches the Gulf faster. From the river's standpoint, which is really just gravity's standpoint, the Atchafalaya is a better route. And for the last century, more and more of the Mississippi's flow has been pushing toward it. Left alone, the Mississippi would not be flowing through New Orleans today. By the calculations of Army Corps of Engineers hydrologists, without human intervention, the Mississippi would have completed its shift to the Atchafalaya Channel sometime in the 1970s. That shift didn't happen because of a complex of dams, floodgates, and navigation locks built in central Louisiana in the 1960s. It's called the Old River Control Structure. Its only job, is to hold the river in place, to maintain the current split, roughly 70% of flow staying in the Mississippi Channel, 30% allowed into the Atchafalaya, to keep the river where engineers want it, while the river tries to go somewhere else. In 1973, a major flood nearly ended that arrangement. The structure failed partially, scouring out beneath its own foundations. For several days, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The Corps threw everything available at it. It held, barely. If it hadn't, everything downstream would have started changing. If it had failed, the Mississippi would have begun moving toward the Atchafalaya. Within years, the channel through New Orleans would have become a slow backwater. The port would have lost its connection to the river's main flow. Ships would have stopped coming. The grain elevators would have emptied for the last time. The city that exists because it sits at the outlet of a continent's drainage system would have found itself sitting next to a shrinking side channel instead. There is no backup plan for this. The Old River Control Structure is inspected and maintained continuously. The Corps monitors it closely. But it is aging infrastructure holding back an increasingly powerful river in a warming climate that is making flood events more severe and more frequent. The Mississippi is not going to stop pushing toward the Atchafalaya. Physics doesn't negotiate. America is not defending New Orleans against hurricanes. It's defending New Orleans against the Mississippi River itself. Those are different problems. One is weather, the other is geology. Weather you can predict and prepare for. Geology operates on a different schedule entirely. Hurricanes come and go, but the river never stops trying to move. So is New Orleans actually irreplaceable? It's a fair question. Modern infrastructure isn't what it was in 1800. America has railroads, pipelines, highways, and other Gulf Coast ports. If New Orleans became unworkable, whether from a catastrophic storm, a levee failure, or the Mississippi finally taking a different route to the Gulf, couldn't we just move the traffic somewhere else? Some of it, yes. Some of it, not at any realistic cost. Railroads already move grain. Pipelines already move oil and gas. Container traffic is flexible enough to shift between ports. Those alternatives exist. The problem is scale. Every year, roughly 60 million metric tons of grain move through the lower Mississippi corridor. That's not a flow you simply redirect because one port has a problem. And we know this because we've already run the experiment. When Katrina shut down the port of New Orleans, shippers didn't reroute to Houston or Mobile. They waited. Because there wasn't another port with the grain elevator capacity, barge network, channel depth, and export infrastructure needed to absorb that volume. More than a century of investment had concentrated in one corridor, and nowhere else on the Gulf Coast had anything comparable. Could America build a replacement? Probably. But it would be one of the largest infrastructure projects in American history. It would take decades, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and still face the same problem. The geography that made New Orleans valuable doesn't really exist anywhere else. That's the part people often miss. Geography doesn't determine everything. Countries overcome geographic disadvantages all the time. Cities succeed in places that shouldn't work. Policy matters, infrastructure matters, human decisions definitely matter. But geography determines the cost of alternatives, and the alternative to New Orleans is extraordinarily expensive. That's why America has never seriously tried to replace it. Not after Katrina, not after any major storm before it. The city isn't indispensable because nobody thought about alternatives. It's indispensable because replacing it would cost more than defending it. Even when defending it means holding back a river that has been trying to leave for decades. Go back to where we started. Much of New Orleans sits below sea level. The river runs above it, the lake sits behind it. The ground is sinking. The hurricanes keep coming. And somewhere in central Louisiana, engineers are still holding the Mississippi River in place. None of that has changed. But here's what the geography actually explains. The same river that makes New Orleans so difficult to defend is the reason it exists at all. The Mississippi didn't just threaten this city, it built it. It gathered the commerce of a continent and delivered it to one place. It turned New Orleans into the outlet for the largest river system in North America. It helped create a city unlike any other in the United States. And then, over time, it started looking for a shorter path to the sea. That's the contradiction at the center of New Orleans. The city exists because of the river, the city survives despite the river. For decades, engineers have been managing that contradiction. Not by defeating the Mississippi, but by delaying it. Every year, the river pushes toward an easier route. Every year, the old river control structure pushes back. And so far, it's working. The reason America keeps rebuilding New Orleans isn't sentiment. It's not nostalgia. It's not even stubbornness. It's that the alternative is harder. The country can rebuild levees. It can repair flood walls. It can recover from hurricanes. What it can't easily replace is the geography that made New Orleans important in the first place. So the fight continues, not against a foreign rival or an economic competitor, against a river. And as long as the Mississippi keeps trying to leave, America will keep trying to stop it. New Orleans is what happens when geography gives a city almost every advantage imaginable, and then spends centuries trying to take them away. If you want to see what it looks like when a city builds a global trade hub with almost none of these natural advantages, the Houston story is the place to go. I'll link it here. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.